The Western State Center is a regional organization. We provide leadership development, technical assistance, and capacity building programs to progressive social justice movement organizations, combining all of the things we just talked about, that use community organizing as their primary vehicle for social change. So, within the sector, our focus is on groups that do community organizing. We work in 8 states, north of California and west of the Dakotas. What I will say also is that I moved back to the West Coast from New York, and that being back in the region, it's not the same as it is out here, right? And so intersectionality is a lived experience when you're on the subway, when you're in Chicago on the L, when your communities are so, in many ways, integrated with one another. And that in our experience, that is less true out west. Communities are more isolated from one another, and they are more segregated. And so the context of the work is really different, and it's important because it's a smaller progressive community. It's a smaller social justice movement, right? And the organizations that are serving marginalized communities, whether it's people of color, LGBTQ, rural, youth audiences, are smaller and even more fragile. If, a claim can be made for fragility, right? And then on top of that, you have a political context in which all of the Western states every once in a while put the entire rights of a community on the ballot and vote on them, right? And so the ballot measures, whether it's around affirmative action, whether it's around English only, whether it's around ESL in the classrooms, whether it's anti-gay, all of that context creates opportunities to directly look at the wedge and to look at which communities are intersectional and who's going to be your ally on the ballot. And so this debate has been happening again and again and again in the West. And as we well heard from the first panel, and as all funders and I think many movement folks are thinking about, what does Prop 8 tell us about the opportunity to do this work in a different way? One of the keys is leadership, right? And while leadership is critical, and it doesn't necessarily go far enough, that'll be my point number 2, it is still a core element of successful movement building work. And so you need buy-in from the executive director at a really fundamental level. And the example I always give in our region is Ramon. He's an incredible ally on LGBTQ issues. And the reason I say that is because he talks about queer issues in spaces where there's no need to, right? Potentially. There's no need to talk about the issue, and he does. And he talks about it in his own community when there are no queers in the room that we know of, or where he's trying to create space for the queer community within the Latino community to come out and be present. Right? And that is significant. The relationship between an organization's base and the issues that you're trying to get folks to move around is critical. And there are really 4 things that we need in order to make that happen, right? The first one is the staff need to be comfortable talking about other people's issues, right? 2, the board has to buy in to put the resources on the table or into the fight. Right? And so the boards actually have to say, it's okay for us to work on someone else's issues, and we are going to allow the executive director and the organization to throw down money, to throw down staff time on this fight, even though we're not necessarily seen as one of the targets. It takes a cultural shift to have organizations talk about other constituencies' issues, right? And that's a cultural shift that takes time, which is the last and 4th successful component, is that it does take time, and that the story that you'll hear from Marcy and Ramon is one about ongoing relationships that have been built for 10 years between the leadership, the board, and the base of both of those organizations. And I want to just highlight that in particular because it's especially true of the harder issues to take on, like reproductive justice or like LGBTQ equality. And that what it takes is moving people through a series of conversations that often go up against core values that other institutions are teaching. Right? And so it takes more time, and our organizations have to have ways to have conversations where an organizer can say to a member, listen, I hear you. I was raised with those same homophobic messages. And I want you to know our organization is committed to social justice, and we're also committed to you as a leader, and we want to be a part of your process, right? Because our organization is committed to this conversation, and we know that we'll need to have this conversation with you over time. We're not going to boot you the first time something comes up. The last piece is that groups need outside support to identify, work plan, and develop resources, right? Because as you're taking on other folks' issues, it's not just that other organizations that are in the fight too, they're in the trenches on their own issues. And it takes outside support in order to be able to support organizational transformation. And I say that not just because I work for an intermediary that's one of the organizations that does that. But really, you know, I think about the story of Western State Center and our work with Basic Rights Oregon. Basic Rights Oregon is a fabulous LGBTQ organization in Oregon that has a primarily white base. And over the last 5 years, Western State Center has been talking to Basic Rights Oregon about how they include racial justice in their work. And it's been 5 years that we've been talking to them about that and sitting with the board and talking with the staff. And now, finally, the organization has really been able to make some transformation where they are developing their own anti-racist organizational programs that train their white base about why immigrant rights matter. And so this year they have done trainings and they have trained over 300 people around LGBTQ rights and immigrant rights, right, to a almost 100% white audience. And the last issue that's around success is that in order to do intersectional work, we have to be okay framing issues differently. And we heard about this already, right? I think about when we talk about race, when we talk about immigration, the frame of the issue has to change in order to bring different communities to the table. And so in particular, I think about the reproductive justice movement, and I think about Asian communities for reproductive justice and the many women of color organizations in California that were fighting the parental notification battles. The messages that moved their communities had to be different than the major pro-choice messages that we were getting. Right? The same is true of Color in California. The messages that they wrote, that they created for moving Latinas around the personhood ballot measure in Colorado had to be fundamentally different than the messages that the mainstream big girl organizations were putting out. Right? And so that had to be okay. I was always looking for benchmarks as a funder about how do I know it's actually happening? One of the pieces to look for is starting the process versus sustaining a program. So it often starts with the passion of an executive director or the passion of a line staff person. But that passion doesn't mean organizational transformation. What organizational transformation takes is a sustainable process that moves an organization institutionally in its process, in its programming, and in an overall cultural shift. Another piece is analysis versus action. We can often stay in the totally theoretical, let's put everything in the kitchen sink model of organizing, and that's not so useful. There has to be concrete action, and Marcy and Ramon, I know, will talk about the ways in which having a specific fight to come together around was critical. The last thing that I'll say, and then I'll save the rest of this, is that there are 3 reasons that Western State Center really thinks that movement building and intersectional work is critical to the organizing we need to do in the future. The first reason is that it's about political power. Using an intersectional or a movement building framework allows us to broaden the base by involving more people in the fight. The second reason is because it adds resources. When we do that, when we add new people to the table and new communities that have not been a part of the process, we're able to leverage new skills and strengths. And then lastly, it creates better solutions. Having an inherently more structural analysis to the problems that our communities face allows us to address the root causes and the structural barriers that create the holes that our communities fall through. There's this analogy about a bridge and children in the water and people falling. Anyway, but the idea is that there's a problem with, you could organize a whole bunch of watches, right, on the river, right, and you could fish all the kids out one by one, or you could go to the bridge and see there's a hole in the bridge, and that's the problem that people keep falling through. And so our analysis is that you get better structural solutions that address the inequities in our communities when we look to the bridge, not to the watches on the water.